Last Meal Monday, where every Monday I tell you about a killer on death row and what they had as their final meal. This week we're going to talk about Carroll Chessman. Carroll was born in 1921 in Michigan, but at a year old, his family moved to Glendale, California, and that's where he stayed. As a teenager, he joined a gang and was heavy in crime. He was actually sent to two different reform schools, but ultimately nothing changed. He was in and out of gangs, and he committed things like armed robbery and car theft, and spent time in prison for both of those offenses. But by the end of 1947, he had been released from Folsom State Prison and was out on the streets. At the beginning of January 1948, a string of armed robberies started occurring across the greater Los Angeles area. The police started noticing a trend. Basically, somebody would pull up to a stoplight and either one or two gentlemen would come out and rob them at gunpoint using a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. When the police started catching on to the fact that these were all similar crimes committed probably by the same person, they dubbed that person the Red Light Bandit. On January 19th, 1948, Regina Johnson and her boyfriend were parked in Pasadena when a man approached the vehicle holding a .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol and robbed them. He then forced Regina to perform an act on him that I am not allowed to talk about on TikTok, and then he left the scene. Unfortunately, police were unable to identify the perpetrator, even though they had Regina and her boyfriend as eyewitnesses. On January 22nd, 1948, a couple was sitting on the side of the road on Mulholland Drive when somebody pulled up behind them, got out of the car, and held them up at gunpoint. The man pulled 17-year-old Mary Alice Mesa from the car and then put her in his own car. That's when her boyfriend took off. He gunned it. The assailant followed, tried to run the boyfriend off the road, but when ultimately he couldn't, he drove Mary Alice to a secluded area where he then essayed her. After the assault, he actually let her go, and the next day, Mary Alice and her boyfriend went to the police to report the crime. The next day, after the crime was reported, the police actually saw the .46 coupe that was being used in these robberies and took chase. A high-speed chase ensued, but ultimately the police were able to catch up with Carroll Chessman and his accomplice, David Knowles. Both men were arrested and interrogated for over 72 hours. Carroll claims that the police beat and tortured him, but at the end of the 72-hour interrogation, Carroll confessed to being the Red Light Bandit and confessed to both sexual assaults. Carroll was charged with 18 counts of robbery, kidnapping, and rape. Ultimately, he was convicted of 17 of those 18 charges, and he was sentenced to death. You heard that correctly. He was sentenced to death. This is because in the 40s and 50s, there was a law called the Little Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping with the intent of bodily harm a capital offense worthy of the death sentence. So Carroll, who committed a kidnapping and then ultimately essayed said kidnapping victim, qualified for this capital offense. He was found guilty and then sentenced to death. The appeals process for this case was incredibly lengthy. Carroll even ended up defending himself on a few of the appeal trials. He filed dozens of appeals and was on death row for a little over 12 years. At this point in time, that was the longest anyone had served on death row. Carroll was put to death on May 2nd of 1960 by the gas chamber. For his final meal, he had an undescribed sandwich and a glass of Coca-Cola. And that brings us to the end of